In the year 2261, when the last of the artificial seasons were switched off and the weather learned again to stumble and sing, a woman named Anna Serin watched the horizon from the roof of the hospital where she worked and tried to decide whether the new twilight looked more like a bruise or a benediction. She was 34, a palliative nurse in a city that had rebuilt itself in rings like the trunk of a tree, and she had the small, durable patience of someone who had learned to sit beside suffering without turning away. But lately the sky had been behaving strangely. Constellations drifting by a finger's width each week, auroras crawling down the equator like slow water, satellites losing their timing as if the clock at the heart of the world had begun to hesitate. And while the world argued about solar storms and quantum interference, Anna kept seeing patterns no graph could hold, dragonflies hovering over the river in formations that spelled a lullaby her mother used to hum, flocks of starlings that turned together just in time with the beeping of a monitor in the children's ward, reflections in windows that stood a fraction out of step with the living faces they returned. The first time she heard the voice was after midnight, in a room that smelled of lemon sanitizer and rain, when the old man in bed 14, whose heart had decided to travel only at night, asked her if she believed in tides that ran through people. And before she could answer, the monitor sang a long, soft tone, the kind that says someone has arrived or departed, and the window hummed so gently she thought it was wind until the glass shaped a word against her skin. Stay. Not sound exactly, but pressure and temperature, like a hand too large and too careful pressing through the air. And the old man smiled before he slept and said, "Do you remember the first time you were called by your name from very far away?" And Anna said that wasn't possible and checked the wiring. After that, her days acquired an undercurrent the way a river acquires silt. Heavy, invisible, more and more present. The sense that something outside the story of human days was leaning close to listen, and the listening itself changed the pitch of things. Sometimes light bent around the bed rails so faintly she felt it only in her teeth. Sometimes the sky wrote a slow cursive across evening that resembled a map to a place no cartographer would dare to draw. Sometimes the elevator stopped between floors and sighed like an animal deciding whether to sleep. She did not speak of it, not at first, because there are only so many kinds of loneliness a person can manage. But the second time the voice came, it did not whisper a command. It asked a question. What is the last thing you would keep if all the rest had to go? And she, startled, answered out loud, though the room was empty except for a girl using a paper crane to row across morphine. And Anna said, "The names," before she could think. Because no one dies to the nameless dark if someone is there to speak them back into the light. And the voice withdrew the way low tide withdraws, careful not to take the shells. By autumn, the city had begun to give up its insistence on certainty. The news used phrases like cosmic variance and dark interference. The university erected a temporary observatory on the stadium roof, and students in blankets drank coffee at 3 a.m. and pretended fear was wonder. Fishermen left offerings of salt and battery packs under the new constellations. Dogs woke and wagged toward corners where no one stood. Anna's mother called from the coast to ask if the river still remembered how to run forward, and Anna said yes, mostly, and they laughed in the way people laugh when what they mean is, "Hold my hand across this distance." At the hospital, a rumor drifted through the night shift that the dying had started keeping odd hours, choosing dawn more often than before, or refusing midnight altogether, as if the threshold had moved. And Anna found that sometimes when she held a patient's hand at the end, she could hear a faint wild music under the drone of machines, something like wind combed through strings of metal 100 miles long. And she found herself counting breaths in a pattern that did not match human rhythm, but soothed the room like rain. One dawn she walked out onto the roof with a blanket and a thermos and found an astronomer already there. A young man with a burn scar across his left cheek and the bright, brittle look of someone whose curiosity had gotten ahead of sleep. His name was Keiji Arata, and he had been sent by the observatory to place a small array of sensors near the river because the water, like everything else, had begun to behave like an antenna. They shared tea and the careful words strangers use when the sky is misbehaving. Do you see it too? Yes. But only if I don't look straight at it. And when the first pale strand of aurora braided itself through the southern clouds at dawn, KG whispered numbers and Anna whispered names, and for a moment the braid thickened as if fed by both. Later, when the voice returned in the elevator between floors, Anna said aloud, "I will not be frightened if you tell me what you are." And the elevator hummed an apology, "We are not a what," and then sang in pressure, in soft push and cool air, a phrase that felt like "we are tide, we are choir. We are the room outside the room." And that night, KG showed her a plot of pulses measured across the city. Subsonics hidden under traffic, under heartbeats, under train brakes, each building answering each river, answering each person at the same slow interval, all of it traveling outward through the clouds, as if the city were practicing a song it had not yet learned the words to. He called it a sympathetic field, and when he pointed to the same interval repeating in the children's ward and in the elevator and in the river, they both laughed without humor and said, "Oh," together, because the interval was the length of a breath if you were a mountain. Two things occurred almost at once. The first was that the hospital filled with a brightness that did not come from bulbs, a light that had the texture of reflection but no source, and that pooled wherever pain was thickest, often enough that orderlies began moving furniture to accommodate it as if it were a polite animal visiting rooms. The second was that the city's clocks lost their agreement and then did not care, to the scandal of the transit authority and the relief of the sleepless. That week a train arrived before it left, according to its schedule, and a man eating breakfast on a balcony saw 2 moons through his coffee steam and then 1, and a woman in the market reached for a lemon and touched instead the warm hand of her dead sister and did not put the lemon back. Anna found a note in a chart pocket in a handwriting she recognized from childhood, her own, age 8, saying, "If the sky ever speaks, listen." KG's instruments registered a non-local correlation between lullabies sung 3 neighborhoods apart. The professor at the observatory said words like permeability and crossphase, and then put his head down on his desk and wept. No one said miracle because miracles belong to causes and this belonged to grief and gravity. In the oncology ward, a boy asked if the stars were falling, and Anna said maybe they were learning to kneel. The voice began to speak not just to her but through her, sometimes in the timbre of wind across the river, sometimes in the weight change of a room when someone walks in, asking questions that were also kindnesses. What did you love when you were small? What have you forgiven? What names have you set down because your hands were too full? And every time someone answered aloud, the lights in the corridor steadied, not brighter, just steadier, as if truth were a voltage. KG brought her to the stadium roof on the night the city finally admitted that something far larger than weather had bent its attention toward them. Crowds lay shoulder to shoulder on the old plastic turf. Families and students and insomniacs and the kinds of people who keep small dogs in their jackets, and the sky above them resembled a patient painting that had been so carefully restored it became unfamiliar. The aurora did not waver, but braided itself into a spiral that everyone agreed was not a spiral exactly, because spirals have centers, and this did not. At its edge, lightning stitched without sound. At its heart, darkness that looked like a pupil looking back. The air cooled to the kind of clean that makes mouths water. KG pressed a sensor against Anna's wrist and whispered, "Not science, but a wish. If it's listening, I hope it hears the ordinary, because that's what we are good at." And Anna, who had not cried in a long time for fear of springing a leak that would never close, said, "Yes, let it hear dishes and street sweepers, and jokes that miss." And the sky obliged. The spiral thickened to the rhythm of 1,000 tired hearts, and then thinned when someone on the 3rd row sneezed and laughed and apologized, and the vastness above them answered with a sigh like a long wave curling under a pier. A city does not usually agree in one direction, but that night everyone leaned forward at once as if a story were beginning, and the voice came not as sound but as balance, tilting the world so gently everyone swayed to adjust, and in that tilt Anna felt something like an apology from a distance measured in light centuries, an old grief arriving late to a party that had refused to end. And she understood 2 things with the unsatisfying certainty of things that are true and useless. 1, that whatever was leaning toward their small blue life was not a ship or a god or a swarm, but something distributed across space like weather is distributed across land, large enough to know oceans as soups, and small enough to touch a wrist vein with respect. 2. That it had heard the first human songs long before humans thought to aim them at the sky, because a field is an instrument when wind remembers it. When the hospital lost power the next week, the generators did not start because the city had decided to be brave without them. The voice entered the corridors through the plastic casters of wheelchairs and the hairline fractures in windows and the holes in paper where staples had been, and it asked, "May we carry?" Anna said, "Not yet," because bodies are also vows, and the voice, multiplicitous, patient, waited. She sat with a woman named Mara who had made a stubborn home in failure, kidneys, marriage, sleep, and whose laugh arrived like a match struck in a dark barn. And Anna told her a story about the time the river froze just enough to forget how to move. And Mara said, "Promise me the sky is still bigger than the roof." And Anna, treacherous and loving, promised, and the voice pushed at her like tide at an ankle. KG, working on the roof under a sky that seemed closer each hour, sent a message to her band. The field peaked at dawn, then dropped as if it had decided something. If you feel a pull, lean into it, not away. The pull came in the stairwell, a shift in pressure, a change in weight. The peculiar intimacy of a crowded elevator when no one speaks. And then the lights returned of their own accord, though the switch was still down, and the monitors in the neonatal ICU, which had been dark, displayed rhythmic green like grass in good rain. A child drew a picture of the sky as a hand. A woman in the cafeteria tasted cinnamon and remembered being 12 on a ferry. The hospital breathed out, then in. You do not get cosmic horror without the trouble of love. And the trouble came with a decision. The field had begun to modulate in a way KG could model but not control, cycling through the city like a tide table rewritten for lungs. And in every cycle, the very old and the very ill felt lighter, not sicker, lighter, as if gravity were a suggestion and pain, a jacket they could set down. Some went in their sleep as gently as leaves go when the branch they loved whispers, "It is time to see the ground." Some refused and stayed because they wanted one more breakfast. Some looked at Anna with the impatient gratitude of a person standing in a doorway while a party they did not wish to leave makes room behind them. The voice never insisted. It asked again and again, "May we carry?" And most times Anna said not yet, and sometimes she said yes, and a room would smell faintly of rain even if the windows were closed. The city was not dying. It was being tuned to an interval in which separation was less violent. Someone posted a sign on the observatory fence. "If you are lost, hum." Strangers hummed and found themselves beside friends. KG slept for 6 minutes on a bench and woke certain the stars have knees. He told Anna, and she laughed, the laugh he had been waiting to hear all month. And he said carefully, "If it wants us for ourselves." And she said, "Yes. The hard part is we are mostly ordinary." And he said that was the point. On the night the sky lowered enough to brush the floodlights, the city gathered again, not in fear now, but in something like the hush before vows. The spiral opened like a door that does not swing, but changes its mind. And what entered was not a thing, but a room. The felt sense of a place without walls, where listening is the furniture and welcome is the floor. People fell silent in the way crowds fall silent at weddings and at last breaths. In that roofless room, Anna felt every name she had ever learned sit up and look at her, and then look beyond her to where the voice waited like a shoreline. And she heard, unmistakably, her father laughing in the kitchen, in the way he had laughed when she miscounted stars and decided 27 was a good number for a universe. And she heard, less distinctly but with the same ache, the names from every chart she had folded, closed, and pressed to her mouth because that was her small secret ritual. And the voice said, "We keep what you keep." And the horror was that this was true and that the keeping cost what keeping costs. KG squeezed her hand and did not let go and said only, "Stay," though he did not say with whom. The field rose to a swell that felt like a held breath, Across the river, every window in the brick factory that had become artist studios lit at once with drawings of boats and hands and keys. At the stadium, a boy threw his flashlight into the air and it hung there, puzzled, then came down gently. The tide turned without permission. Someone somewhere said amen, and a scientist wrote it down as data. When the pull came for Anna, it was not at work. It was on the hospital roof at dawn while she measured the temperature of a wind that had learned to alternate languages. The voice said, "May we carry?" And she waited for the panic that did not arrive. She thought of the bodies she had closed and the eyes she had kept open long enough for a last look, and the jokes she had said badly on purpose to pry one more smile out of a reluctant mouth. She thought of the ordinary mercy of soup. She thought of the terrible, tender work of washing a person who will not wash again. She thought of KG's scar and tea and the way he said numbers like lullabies. She thought of her mother on the coast, hum-singing weather reports like psalms. She thought of dragonflies writing music over a river, and she answered aloud, "Not yet, but take my fear instead," and felt something immense accept it with a gratitude that could have been mistaken for weather. She sat because her knees were made for smaller rooms and cried because that is what some doors ask of you on the threshold. When she looked up, the sky had risen a little, as if giving them room. The years after were not an ending, but a long negotiation with wonder. The city learned ways to live when a sky that loved you also asked you to sing. Funerals became walks to the river with lists of names and a basket of bread. Births became quiet because newborns took a second before crying to listen first. The hospital installed wind harps along the eaves and measured success, not just by discharges, but by how many stories made people put down their phones. KG stayed and made instruments that translated subsonics into colors so old women could knit weather into blankets. Anna stayed because there is no leaving a house that contains your work and your ghosts and your tea, and she grew older in the way people in good cities grow older, radiating a competence that makes panicked rooms look for her. Sometimes the voice still asked, "May we carry?" And sometimes she said yes for someone else, and sometimes not yet for herself. And always afterward the elevators ran smoothly for a week. Occasionally the sky misremembered which stars go where, and the astronomers worked all night to help it recall. Sometimes the river forgot it had a bank and spilled a little into the streets, and in the morning apologized by returning lost keys in the mouths of fish. Miracles became maintenance, and maintenance practiced faithfully revealed itself as prayer. On the last night of the long aurora, because even a listening sky must rest, the stadium filled one more time, not for spectacle but for a kind of roll call. The spiral thinned until it was only a single line of green fire drawn across the darkness like the underline of a name, and the voice, large as rain and careful as a nurse's hand, said, "We are tide, we are choir, we are room. We came because you called. We stay because you kept. When you are ready, we will carry. Until then, sing." And the line faded to the usual mathematically disrespectful scatter of stars. People waited, breathing like a single animal with many lungs, and then began, one by one and then all together, to hum the note they had learned when the city became an instrument. Anna hummed with them until her throat buzzed and her chest loosened and her eyes stung, and KG's hand found hers again. And for a long, sweet minute, the fear that always hums under love quieted enough to show its other face, attachment, and the wind stole a corner of her scarf and ran away, laughing, which is something wind can do when it has heard its name spoken back to it. Sometimes, years later, visitors ask what it was like, and people in the city shrug and hand them tea and say, "Like learning your house has more rooms," or "Like someone taller than mountains leaned down to help with the heavy box," or "Like grief decided to walk with us instead of against." And no one uses the word miracle because that would imply it happened once. Anna, older now, still goes to the roof before dawn, and sometimes she hears her name called from very far away and says not yet without fear. And sometimes she hears no name at all and says the names of others, so the sky will remember its work. The horror did not end because horror is only the shadow of scale, and scale remains. But the sorrow learned a way to be beautiful, and beauty learned a way to be useful. And on certain mornings when fog braids itself through the city like the first thought of a prayer, Anna can feel the field's slow tide tilt under her feet and knows that somewhere, impossibly far and intimately near, the choir that is not a who and not a what is adjusting itself to her small, ordinary breath and thinking in its way, stay and sing.